Welcome to the video tutorial on how to use the Deploy via Web simple method. So I've got Tourney loaded right now, and there are other videos you can watch to find out how to configure your tournament options and download pairings and other things. So the focus of this tutorial will be simply how to use the Deploy via Web option, the simple method. So to start the Deploy via Web wizard, we're just going to select the remote menu and then Deploy via Web. And we first come to the introduction page where we have some choices on which method of web deployment we want to use. The focus of this tutorial will be the simple method, but there's also basic and advanced. Simple is basically the easiest method that requires that you only have an email address and internet access. If you have a little bit more ability to host web pages, you can use the basic option. That just requires that you have your own web space or that you've purchased the Tourney web hosting add-on. And the advanced method is for people who have basically some understanding of how script files and HTML pages work and have a server that they can host those files on. You can basically self-contain your web entry on your own web server. So the focus of this will be the simple method, so we're going to go ahead and select the simple method of web deployment and select next. Now we come to the overview screen where we need to associate an email address for this pool. Basically what's going to happen is when the entries are submitted, they'll be categorized under this email address to be able to keep track of them by whoever's pool is being run. So for our example, I'm going to use the tutorials at thesideline.com as the email address. The pool ID is not required. It's meant for if you have more than one pool that you're running and you need to be able to segregate your entries into different files, you want to use a pool ID. So if you were running, say, an office pool and a friends and family pool, you would have two different pool files within Tourney. And when you use the Deploy via Web, you're going to use the same email address, and so we need to differentiate those within your email address by using the pool ID. And you might specify something like, pool ID 1 is your office pool and pool ID 2 is your friends and family pool. But whatever number you use isn't really that relevant. It's just a matter of what you can remember to distinguish between multiple pools that you're running. In my case, I'm just doing one pool, so I'm going to leave the pool ID optional. You then have a choice of whether or not you want your players to receive an email copy of their picks. This is purely a preference on what you want to do. My suggestion would be to not email them a copy of the picks when they submit them. But what I've found is more appropriate is to wait until you have the entries all loaded into the program, and then just use the player picks report and email everyone a copy of their picks after you have them loaded. This way there's no confusion in that maybe they submitted 5 entries, but you're only going to accept 1. They're going to get 5 emails and think that they have 5 entries when in fact you've only really loaded one of those and you've ignored the other 4. So generally it's best to not email them a copy just to avoid confusion, and wait till you get all the entries loaded into the program and then do the player picks report and email each player a copy of their picks. That way they're certain to know that you haven't received their entry and they're in the pool. And finally, the last option on this screen is the receipt mode. And you have 2 options of receipt mode. This is basically how you plan on retrieving your entries once they've been submitted. The all entries in one file or the each entry by email. The all entries in one file is by far the most recommended way of receiving your entries. What that means is every time an entry is submitted, the entry is stored on a file on the Tourney.com website and just continues to collect entries until you're ready to download them. That way when it comes time to download them, with just in one single time you can load every single entry that's out there. If you choose the entry by email, instead of storing them in a file on the Tourney site, it just emails you a copy of the entry, and then you have to go in to each email that you get and copy and paste and load each entry one by one. So the entry by email takes much more time because you have to one by one load the picks into the program, and there's also a chance that the person may type in your email address incorrectly, or for whatever reason the email doesn't get delivered, either mail servers are down or internet is slow. So typically I would recommend against using the each entry by email and use the all entries in one file. And that's what we're going to use for this example. And if you want more information on those receipt methods, you can select the more details. So now we're going to go on to our entry options. And here we have a choice of, on our entry page, what we want to call the title of the page. You can use anything you want here. We're going to leave ours called Enter Your Picks. And I have some options for a deadline. If I want to specify when the entries must be submitted in order for me to accept them, I can fill out an entry deadline and give it a date. So you can choose not to use one if you want to let people submit entries, as long as you want. Typically you'd want to set this to the time when maybe the first games would start. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and say that the deadline is Thursday, March 18th, and we're going to say at 10 o'clock a.m. That gives us a couple hours before the games start, and that way we're just sure that nobody submits any entries after that time. And also notice that the deadline is based on Eastern Standard Time, so if you're in a different time zone, just make sure that you're specifying a time based on the Eastern time zone. Then we have the redirect options. Basically what this means is when your players submit their entries, they're presented with a page that shows them a confirmation of their selections, and on that page you can choose to have a redirect link back to your home page or back to wherever you would like them to go. By default there is none, so they'll just go to that page and that's where they'll be. But you could choose to have just a link on that page that would take them to whichever page you'd like them to go to. So let's say after they submit their picks, I'd like to have them with a link that would take them back to the Tourney page. So I can do this, and then when they submit their entries, they'll have a link on there that says return to pool page, and it'll take them to turbotourney.com. The other option on the redirect is the immediate redirect. And what that means is that after the entry is processed on the TurboTourney web server, it will just immediately take them to this location versus showing them a copy of their entry. So if you just want to collect the entry and send them back to maybe a confirmation page on your site, that's where you would put this option. That's how you would use this option. So in our case, we're just going to use the redirect hyperlink, and we'll take them back to turbotourney.com. Now we have our player information, and what you see here is basically the fields that I've defined as my player fields, and I can now choose on the entry page what information I want to collect from each player, and whether or not it's required on the entry form. The first field, the player ID field, is always required. This has to be unique for each player that enters the pool, and so by default it has to be included on the page, and it's also required. And then all the other fields, then you can determine whether or not it shows on the entry page. So in our example, we're going to go ahead and include phone number and fax number and email address, and I'm only going to require an email address and a phone number, and if they want to put in a fax number they can. If not, that's fine, we'll allow it. And we're not collecting information 4 and 5, which are the check boxes, so we'll just leave those blank. And then on the entry options now, we have some choices of if we want to allow the players to attach a comment to their entry. So after they submit their picks, they're presented with an option that says, would you like to send a comment to the pool administrator? And they can type in some preform text that would send you a message. And then we have another option for using a drop-down list for name, last name, first name, which basically means your player ID field. So whatever you've defined as your player ID field, whether it's name or email address or username or whatever, you can provide a drop-down for this. And when you first start your pool, if you have nobody loaded, it really isn't a relevant option for you. It's more for if you preload your pool file with, say, all your players, like if you have 10 players and you load all your players and you want them to just go to the entry page and select their name from the list, you can do that. What's more commonly used for is if you're doing a repick pool, where after the first and second rounds you run another repick pool, and players make picks again now based on those basically like the Sweet 16. In order to keep the picks together so that you know that an entry from the Sweet 16 matched an entry from the 64 team pool, you have them just select their name from the list, and that way that person's picks get combined with their previous to keep their point totals together. Otherwise, if they'd keyed in a different name, maybe they spelled their name a little bit differently or put a middle initial, it's not going to find a match on their name, and so we'll think it's a new entry. So typically you would only need to use the drop-down list if you were running a repick pool or if you had your players already loaded. And then you have an option of, if you do use the drop-down list, do you want to allow new players to enter the pool? So if you've got 10 people and you only want those 10 people to enter, you wouldn't want to select this option. But if you wanted to make it available that even though they weren't in the list, they could still submit an entry, you'd want to select this option. And then use shaded background input fields is simply just a preference on excuse me, a preference on how the fields look on the page. If you select the shaded background option, the entry fields will have a background color that matches the header of the entry page, so it just kind of gives it a nice look and feel to it. But you can turn it off if you don't like it. So for our example, we're going to use these options, except we're not going to use the drop-down list. Now I have some additional comment fields that I can enter additional information I'd like to put on the entry page that they're presented as they're making their picks, and also presented to them after they've submitted their entry. And what I like to do is just use the sample text. If you just select the sample buttons, it will pre-fill these fields with some sample comments, such as you can see here, please fill out the pick sheet by making selections. When finished, press the submit picks button. And for the after they've submitted, it simply has it's been processed, and don't forget to print the page. But you could use any kind of comment you want here. If you want to change this to your entry's been processed, thank you for entering, you can do that. So just two free-form fields where you can type in anything you would like to have show up on the entry page. Now we have the entry sheet style. So we have an option of choosing between two different types of entry sheets, two different types of pick sheets. We have a drop-down list option and a point-click list option. The drop-down will basically give the player a choice of picking from the teams in just a simple drop-down fashion. They pick one of the teams. The point and click is where they just go and they click on the team that will advance them to the next round automatically. Again, it's purely a preference on what you choose to use. As you can see here, the drop-down team, it's a little bit easier for them to understand what they need to do because the drop-down list shows up on the page and they know they have to go and select one. But it does take a little bit longer for them to go through and select the team one by one. And sometimes if the person's machine does not have enough memory, enough systems resources, the drop-downs may get jumbled. So it's loading 63 drop-downs onto that page, and sometimes that page can be quite complex. So generally for a pool of 64 teams like the basketball tournament, I'd recommend the point-click method. So it's similar to how the program interface works, where you just click on a team and it moves into the next round. It requires less in terms of the system resources, and you won't get those jumbled drop-downs. But the players need to make sure they know how to enter the page, because when the page first displays, they just have the teams. They may not know they have to go over and click on one to advance it. So, but I just would recommend using the point-click. Then you have an option too. If you use that option, as they hover over the team, if you'd like it the team name to change, either to a different color, or maybe to be bolded. By default, it uses the bolding, so that way they can kind of tell that as they click over a team and move their cursor over a team, that they can select it. And so we'll leave these options as they are here, and we'll go on to the next screen, which is the post-entry page. So basically now you have a summary of all of the options that you've selected. Shows you that we're using the simple method, and we are shown which player fields that we're going to collect and which ones are required and not required. As you can see, the fax number we said was not required and all the other ones were, and we're not using those fields. And we have our entry deadline is March 18th at 10 o'clock a.m. We're saying that they can enter a comment, so we're using the shaded background. And here we see the additional comments that we entered into those text fields. So at this point, our deploy via web is all set up and ready to go. And We just need to now get a password from the TurboTourney.com website, and this is used to make sure that the email address that you're entering you actually have access to, so that someone else can't just spoof your email address and start collecting entries under your address. So just a way to ensure that you're using an address that really belongs to you. So we're going to go ahead and select the get password, and we're prompted to say the password's been emailed to me at that tutorials@sideline.com address. So I just have to then get the email, and I happen to have a copy of that email here. So it gives me excuse me, gives me the information about the pool, and here's my password that I'm going to use. So I just have to copy that password and paste it into the password field, and that's all I need to do, and I can now post my page. And I'm being told now that I don't have any pairings yet, so a generic entry page will be created, which is fine because we don't have the pairings yet. So it's going to post my entry page to TurboTourney.com, and now I have the pages there, and it's telling me here's the URL to my page. So this is the URL that I need to give my players to tell them here's where you go to enter your picks for my pool. And you have a couple of options here. You can view the page directly. So if we select that option, it loads up our browser, takes us right to that page, and as you can see, it has our player information here, and we see our comments. So it's created the entry page for us. And I can also say copy this URL, and then if I want to, I can go ahead and if I want to send an email to all my players, I can just paste this into an email message and send it to all the players, and it has a link to my entry page for them to go to and enter their picks. And now two more options on this screen to save our settings, which we'll want to do since we want to keep this information that we've just entered. And the last one here is the include entry page in the web report package. If you plan on using the build website or the report package or the mysideline.com hosting service, you want to make sure you select that option so that when you create your full-blown website, it actually includes a link to this entry page that we just created. And that's all there is to creating an entry page. So we're going to finish this, and now let's go through and we're going to simulate that we actually have some teams. So we're going to set our year back to 2003, and we're going to go to the pairings screen and download last year's pairings. And now we're just going to go back through the remote deploy via web. So you can almost imagine like the first time we did this was before the selection show, so we didn't have any pairings, but wanted to make sure that our entry page was working. So we did that part now, and now we're going to just basically simulate as if the pairings have come out and we just downloaded them from the TurboTourney website. So once we load the new pairings into the program, we have to go back through the deploy via web and rebuild our entry sheet now. But since it remembered all of our settings, we pretty much just have to next through these screens until we generate the page. So we're just going to select next and go through these screens until we get to the last page. And now we're going to repost our entry page back to the TurboTourney website. And now this page will contain the actual teams. And if you notice, we didn't get this message that we did before about that there's no pairings found. Now if I go and view the page, as you can see, now we've got the teams all loaded here, and the players can go ahead and make their picks, and they'll be stored on the TurboTourney.com web server until I choose to load them. And we'll cover how to load the entries from the web in another tutorial. So this is just a quick example of how you would get started using the deploy via web simple method.